the floor for questions. Please place your questions in the question and answer section, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. This program is being translated in Rohingya and Burmese. Our thanks go to our two translators who have quite a task to complete. If you want to hear the translation, you can switch to the Rohingya or Burmese channels at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, Chairman Nurul Islam, the floor is yours.
Rohingya ဘာသာစကားကိုနားထောင်ခြင်း Rohingya တို့ယူပေးနိုင်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာယခုအစီအစဉ်စတင်ပါပြီအန်ကယ် Nurul Islam ကိုဖိတ်ခေါ်ပါရစေရှင်ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
Thank you very much Regina Thank you everyone
ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ် Regina ရေအခုလိုပြောပြတာ
And first of all I as the chairman of the Arakan Rohingya National Organization
ကျွန်တော်ဦးအနေနဲ့မိတ်ဆက်ကမယ်ဆိုရင်တော့ကျွန်တော်က ARNO ရဲ့ဥက္ကဋ္ဌတူဖြစ်ပါတယ်
I thank every participants and the panelists
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့ကတော့တက်ရောက်လာသူတွေနဲ့ဆွေးနွေးပေးသူအားလုံးကိုကျေးဇူးတင်တယ်လို့ပြောပါရစေ
for your time
ဘာသာပြန်တွေကိုလည်းကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်မိမိတို့ရဲ့အချိန်တွေကိုထည့်ပြီးတော့ယခုလိုလာပြီးတော့ပြည်သူတွေအတွက်ကျေးဇူးများကြီးတင်ပါတယ်
Professor and Dr. Habib Siddiqui
Dr. Habib Siddiqui နဲ့ Professor Michael Chani တို့ကအားဖြည့်ကူညီပေးမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
I am just
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့ကတော့
a brief overview of the Rohingya history
Rohingya လူမျိုးတွေရဲ့သမိုင်းကြောင်းကိုအနှစ်ချုပ်ပြီးပြောသွားမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
To begin with, history is the matter of life and measure of its performance. It reflects human life in all passing phases.
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့အဓိကကြတော့ပြောချင်တာကတော့
and evaluates its works through ages.
အခုလိုမျိုးကျွန်တော်တို့အနေနဲ့က
Every country or every people has history.
နိုင်ငံတိုင်းမှာဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေဆိုတာရှိပါတယ်
People past history determining the pace of present progress and the shape of history.
မိမိတို့အနေနဲ့ကဒီဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေကကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာတူညီသောသမိုင်းကြောင်းအစဉ်အလာတွေလည်းရှိပါတယ်
Rohingya are a predominantly a Muslim community.
Rohingya တွေကကြတော့အစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာကိုအဓိကပဲကြသူတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Unfortunately their history has remained totally neglected.
ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကသမိုင်းကြောင်းအစဉ်အလာအရကြီးသူတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်သို့တော်ညာလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့တွေရဲ့သမိုင်းကြောင်းတွေကဖုံးကွယ်ထားခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်စိတ်မကောင်းစရာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Like many indigenous ethnic peoples living on Burma
ကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာရှိတဲ့ပြီးတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံအပါအဝင်ကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာရှိတဲ့
their culture distinct
ဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေအတိုင်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကလည်းဌာနေတိုင်းသားမျိုးနွယ်စုတစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့မှာကိုယ်ပိုင်ဘာသာစကားရှိပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကရခိုင်ဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေနဲ့လည်းအတူတူကျွန်တော်တို့ရှေ့ကလေးအတူတူကနေခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Their sublime civilization was a gift to the whole people of the kingdom of Arakan.
မှာ Arakan ဆိုတဲ့ဘုရင်နိုင်ငံတော်ရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
and prospered in international trade.
ဒီ Arakan ဆိုတဲ့ဘုရင်နိုင်ငံတော်ကဆိုရင်တစ်ချိန်တစ်ခါ
ideas and learning a flourishing civilization
နိုင်ငံတကာပင်လယ်ရေကြောင်းတွေမှာအင်မတန်မှကိုအောင်မြင်ခဲ့တဲ့
in modern
ဖြစ်ပါတယ်ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်မိမိတို့က
For centuries Arakan had the civilizations Hindu Buddhist and Islamic
ပြီးတော့ဒီဒေသကဆိုရင် Arakan ဒေသကဆိုရင် Hindu တွေရောဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေရောမွတ်စလင်တွေရောရောပြုံးပြီးတော့နေထိုင်အစေအစဉ်စကလေးကနေထိုင်လာခဲ့ကြတဲ့ဌာနေဒေသတစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်
The ancient Arakanis were descended from Aryan
ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကဆိုရင် Aryan မျိုးနွယ်စုဝင်တွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Rohingya of today are true embodiment of the ancient people of Arakan. But in medieval time, there was reorientation eastward. The area fell under pagan dominance, and the Arakanese people began to speak a dialect of Burmese, which continues to this day.
ဒီမှာဆိုရင် Arakan ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်ဒီ Arakan ဒေသရဲ့ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေကသူတို့တွေကဗမာဘာသာစကားကိုအခြေပြုတဲ့ရခိုင်ဘာသာစကားကိုပြောဆိုတာခဲ့ကြပါတယ်ယနေ့အဖြစ်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
people to travel to the east by sea
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်
Arakan even during the pre-Islamic days
အစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာထွန်းကားတဲ့ခေတ်မှာ Arakan ဒေသကလည်းခေတ်ပြိုင်ထွန်းကားခဲ့တဲ့ဒေသတစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
1788 AD, some Hindu dynasty rules over the certain limited area of this region, along the capital along the river Lemu.
မိမိတို့မှာ
In 788 AD,
Arakan ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်
a new
1900 ဒေသမတိုင်ခင်ကတည်းက Hindu လူမျိုးစုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
Vaishali
ဒီအခါမှာဆိုရင်ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေရောက်လာပါတယ် ပြီးတော့ဆိုရင်ဒီဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေဖြစ်တဲ့ Hindu ဘာသာဝင်တွေကလည်းဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်ကိုကူးပြောင်းသွားပါတယ်ထိုနည်းတူစွာတချို့ကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေဖြစ်လာခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
occurred over and over in the coast of Arakan and Chittagong.
အဲ့ဒီအပြင်ဒီ Arakan ဒေသနဲ့ Chittagong ဒေသနှစ်ခုကပူးဆက်ဆက်မှုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Muslim population in Arakan went down during the long period of 5 centuries following the conquest of the Easterly Hindu kingdom of Vaishali by the Mongolian population.
Hindu ဘုရင်နိုင်ငံကိုလည်းသိမ်းပိုက်နိုင်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Mrau was the last dynasty of Arakan. It was built in Armenia, also known as the Slomacha, after he was reinstated to his throne by the king of Bengal with a formidable force.
Bengal ကဘုရင်ကဖျက်ဆီးဖို့ကြိုးစားခဲ့ပါတယ်
Mrau was the most glorious period. His kings adopted the Muslim title like Pasha.
ဥမာရှိတဲ့ဘုရင်တွေကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေရဲ့ဘွဲ့အမိတွေကိုလည်းခံယူခဲ့ပါတယ်
and
ဒီအခါမှာဆိုရင်မိမိတို့ကမင်းသက်တွေနဲ့လည်းလူဆက်ဆံမှုပြုလုပ်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Kalama Islamic Declaration of Faith in Arabic script
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီမှာ Arakan ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်အာရဗီဘာသာစကားကိုလည်းရုံးသုံးဘာသာစကားအဖြစ်သုံးစွဲခဲ့ပါတယ်နန်းတွင်းတွေထဲမှာလည်းသုံးခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
During his days as an independent kingdom until 1784 Arakan encompassed
1984မတိုင်ခုနှစ်အထိ Arakan ဒေသက
in the southern part of today's Bangladesh
ဒေသယခုဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်နိုင်ငံတောင်ပိုင်းအထိဝင်ခဲ့ပါတယ် Arakan နဲ့ Chittagong ဒေသကဆိုရင်ခွဲခြားလို့မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
Cultural and historical considerations quite often Muslim contribution in Arakan was too great to the extent that began with the spread of the Muslim civilization there. Because of the political and commercial link between those two territories, Korean used to call Arakan extended Chittagong and Chittagong Greater Arakan.
ဒီတော့က Chittagong ဒေသနဲ့ Arakan ဒေသကခွဲလို့မရပါဘူး
For a long time there was no political boundary between Arakan and Chittagong.
အချိန်ကြာအထိကို Arakan ဒေသနဲ့ Chittagong ဒေသက border တစ်ခုတည်းမှာရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
Either Chittagong as an integral part of Arakan, Arakan as a federal state of Bengal for a considerable period of time.
Bengal ရဲ့ပြည်နယ်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါသေးတယ်
Either in Chittagong or Arakan or double home and citizenship in both provinces. This is true with the ethnic people living on all along the borders of Burma's vast territory.
နိုင်ငံတစ်ခုလုံးရဲ့ဒီ border area မှာနေထိုင်တဲ့သူတွေကဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်ကူးလို့ဆက်ဆက်ပြီးတော့နေထိုင်ကြတယ်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Chin people in Bangladesh, and in Thailand, and Marama in Bangladesh,
ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကလည်းဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာနေကြပါတယ်မြန်မာမှာလည်းခွာပြီးနေကြပါတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးနေဆက်နေတဲ့ဆောက်ဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်နိုင်ငံတွေမှာဆက်ပြီးတော့ဒီနိုင်ငံလူမျိုးစုတွေကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံလုံးမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
In the similar pattern, the Rohingya also inhabit
Rohingya တွေကလည်း Chittagong မှာလည်းနေထိုင်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်ယခုအခေါ်ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်ယခင်အခေါ် Arakan ဒေသမှာလည်းနေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
More people can be Rakhine in Burma and Bangladesh again the same Mok and Rakhine can be
ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကကြတော့ မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာရခိုင်လူမျိုးလို့ခေါ်ကြပါတယ်ဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာတော့သူတို့ကို
develop in Arakan from peoples of various ethnical background over the several stages be ethnic Rohingya after the name of Rohang
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေက Rohang လို့လည်းပြောကြပါတယ်
popular name in the region. The word Rohingya means people of Arakan or Rohang. Due to political persecutions and occasional wars or forced expulsion of people, the influx of refugees from Arakan into Bengal and Chittagong has almost been intermittent phenomena continues till today. In 1784, a number of people from Arakan Rohingya fled to Chittagong to escape massacre and persecution of the Burmese occupying forces. They assimilated in Bengal. For example, the Rohai comprising nearly half of the population in southern Chittagong.
စစ်တကောင်းရဲ့တောင်ပိုင်းဒေသမှာဆိုရင်ထက်ဝက်ကျော်လောက်က
to Arakan.
ရခိုင်လူမျိုးတွေလည်းရှိပါတယ်ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာကိုကိုးကွယ်ကြပါတယ်
Despite this, Burmese
ဒီလိုမျိုးဖြစ်လင့်ကစားမိမိတို့က
and the ultra nationalist Rakhine claim that the Rohingyas are
ဒီလိုမျိုးလူတွေကပေါ့နော်ကျွန်တော်တို့
any evidence
လူတွေကိုဘယ်လိုပြောကြလဲဆိုတော့ရခိုင်အစွန်းရောက်တွေကဘာပြောလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုဘင်္ဂါလီလို့ပြောကြပါတယ်ခင်ဗျ
in the strict sense illegal immigration
သူတို့တွေရဲ့
migration that may have
အဆိုအရဆိုရင်တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကကိုယ်ဝင်ဘင်္ဂါလီတွေလို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုသုံးနှုန်းကြပါတယ်ဒါကမမှန်ပါဘူးခင်ဗျာ
from any parts of India to Burma was perfect
ကျွန်တော်တို့က
and no
ဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေသာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
by the Burmese government not even the infamous 1982
ဘာမှအစိုးအရတွေတောင်မရှိခင်မှာကျွန်တော်တို့လူမျိုးတွေကအဲ့ဒီဒေသမှာနေဝင်ရောက်နေထိုင်အခြေချနေခဲ့ကြသူတွေသာလင်းဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Since 1942 program in Arakan
1942ခုနှစ်မှာပြဿနာအကြီးကြီးတက်ခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါကတော့ဘာလဲဆိုတော့
from 1962 military rule by General Nehru they have faced genetic
လွတ်လပ်ရေးကာလဂျိုးပန်ကနဦးဂျိုးပန်မှုတွေဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးတော့နိုင်ငံတစ်ခုပေါ်လာပြီးတော့လွတ်လပ်ရေးရသွားပါတယ်
into Bangladesh and other countries
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်ရှိပါတယ်
communities of non-Rohingya from impoverished Arakan are in
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာ1962မှာအာဏာသိမ်းမှုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
it would make very little sense for
ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအခုဒီမှာက
in a more
ဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ခေါ်တဲ့နိုင်ငံကပေါ်လာတာကမကြသေးခင်ကမှပေါ်လာတာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ထိုနည်း၎င်းပါပဲမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုတဲ့နိုင်ငံကလည်းပေါ်လာတာကလည်းလွတ်လပ်ရေးရပြီးမှမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးတော့ပေါ်လာတာခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခေတ်သစ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးပေါ်လာခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျအဲ့ဒီလိုမျိုးနိုင်ငံအသစ်တွေမရှိခင်ကတည်းကကျွန်တော်တို့လူမျိုးစုရိုဟင်ဂျာလူမျိုးစုကဒီဒေသတွေမှာကြိုပြီးတော့ရောက်နှင့်ကြပြီးဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျ
and the Burmese legislation section 3(1) of the union
မြန်မာဥပဒေမှာဆိုရင်
amended as December 1968 states for the purpose of the constitution
1962မှာ
the expression any of the indigenous races of
ဘာပြောထားလဲဆိုတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရဲ့ကရင်ဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေထိုသူတွေကိုကချင်ချင်းကရင်ရှမ်းမွန်ရခိုင်ဆိုပြီးတော့ပြောထားပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေက
within the union as their permanent home from
မိမိတို့ရဲ့ဒေသမှာဌာနေနိုင်ငံပြင်ရင်းနိုင်ငံအဖြစ်အစဉ်တစိုက်နေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြသူများဒီ
political consideration
အလိုအလျောက်နိုင်ငံသားများဖြစ်ရမည်ဆိုပြီးတော့ရေးသားထားပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီတော့ပြောချင်တာကကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တမိုင်းကပုံဖြတ်ခြင်းခံထားရပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တမိုင်းကဖြောက်ထားခြင်းခံရပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားဖြစ်လင့်ကစားကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုကဲကျင်ထားကြပါတယ်
council up to 2015
အဲ့ဒီတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့2015ခုနှစ် မှာလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကရွေးကောက်ပွဲမှာလွတ်လပ်စွာဝင်ပြိုင်ခွင့်မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
November 1947
ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့နိုဝင်ဘာ1948ခုနှစ်ကိုပြန်ကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်လည်း
Rohingya in the state of Arakanese Muslim
ရိုဟင်ဂျာဒေသမှာရှိတဲ့အာရကန်နီစ်မွတ်စလင်တွေကိုရိုဟင်ဂျာလို့ခေါ်ပါသည်လို့ရေးသားထားချက်တွေရှိပါတယ်
Burma Broadcasting Service
ပြီးတော့
Rohingya News Program
Burma Broadcasting Service BBS လို့ခေါ်ခဲ့တဲ့တစ်ချိန်လုံးကအတန်လွင့်ဌာနရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာရိုဟင်ဂျာဘာသာစကားကိုလွှင့်ထုတ်လွှင့်ခဲ့ပါတယ်တိုင်းရင်းသားဘာသာအစီအစဉ်အနေနဲ့အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒါကလွတ်လပ်ရေးရပြီးတဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုတိုင်းရင်းသားအဖြစ်အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့တဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေလည်းရှိခဲ့ပါသေးတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi with the hope that
Nobel ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်ရောက်ပြန်တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအင်မတန်မှကိုမျှော်လင့်ချက်ကြီးကြီးထားခဲ့ကြပါတယ်တရားသဖြင့်အတိုင်းပြည်ကိုအုပ်ချုပ်မယ်လူတိုင်းအခွင့်အရေးတွေရမယ်လို့မျှော်လင့်ခဲ့ကြတော့ညလည်းဘာတွေဖြစ်ခဲ့လဲဆိုတော့စစ်တပ်ရဲ့ဒီကျွန်တော်တို့ဆက်မှုတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်တို့ကရင်ကုန်နှုတ်ပိတ်နှုတ်ဆက်နေခဲ့ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
The ethnic Rohingyas have lost all
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေကအခွင့်အရေးတွေဆုံးရှုံးခဲ့ပါတယ်မိမိတို့နေအိမ်တွေကနေမောင်းထုတ်ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အခြားဒေသကိုတွန်းပို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်မောင်းထုတ်ခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်ဒါအပြင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုကိုယ့်အိမ်မှာနေတဲ့သူတွေကိုတခြားနေရာကနေခိုးဝင်လာကြတယ်လို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုဆွဆွဲကြပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါကနိုဘယ်ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်မှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်နောက်ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေအစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်လူမျိုးတုံးတပ်ပွဲကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ရင်ဆိုင်ခဲ့ရပါတယ်
However, it should be emphasized that the return to military rule is unacceptable.
အခုကျွန်တော်တို့က
Burma embraces
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာစစ်တပ်ရဲ့အာဏာသိမ်းမှုကိုပြန်လည်ခံလိုက်ရပါပြီ
regardless of race, ethnicity and
အဲ့ဒီကြောင့်ဘာဖြစ်လာလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအခုကအားလုံးရောပြုံးပြီးတော့ဖိနှိပ်နှိမ့်ပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုတွေကိုအတူတူခံစားနေရပါပြီဘယ်ဘာသာပဲကိုယ်ကွယ်ကွယ်ဘယ်လူမျိုးပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ကျွန်တော်တို့အားလုံးကအတူတူနှိမ့်ပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုကိုခံနေရပါပြီအဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်မိမိတို့ကအခုကအားလုံးကအတူတကွယုံထားရမယ်အချိန်ဖြစ်ပါပြီမိမိတို့ကကိုယ်ပိုင်ပြဋ္ဌာန်းခွင့်တွေကိုတောင်းဆိုရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီအချိန်မျိုးမှာဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်ခင်ဗျတရားသဖြင့်နီးလန်းကနေကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်
under the future federal union
အဲ့ဒီတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကြီးကိုအနာဂတ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံက Federal ခေတ်သစ်ပြည်ထောင်စုနိုင်ငံတော်အဖြစ်ရရှိရေးအတွက်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကစုမှုကောင်းတောင်းပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့လည်းတကယ်မျှော်လင့်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျဒါမှဒါနဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးကလူမျိုးပေါင်းစုံဘာသာပေါင်းစုံတရားဝါပြောစွာနေထိုင်နိုင်တဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးဖြစ်နေမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
This is a fair coherent
ဒီလိုလုံမှသာလင်ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေက
Thank you for your listening Thank you
တိုင်းပြည်တိုးတက်မှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်အခုလိုမျိုးနားထောင်ပေးတာကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
Chairman Nurul Islam and to everyone who's experiencing sound issues we'll continue to work on it just make sure that you have the channel that you want selected and click original audio off and we will continue to improve it. In the meantime, I'm going to pass the floor on now to Professor Michael Charney. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me today to give my thoughts on Rohingya history. I'm going to give some general impressions because the time isn't huge and because I know that this is being translated for multiple audiences and I want to be kind to the translators. Like all ethnic groups in Myanmar, the origins of the Rohingya identification or self-identity has murky origins. We do not have the details, never will, on exactly how the process of ethnic formation occurred in its earliest centuries. We know that we know that Islam there's a good chance Islam has been present in Rakhine at least since the 7th century. It would also appear that the main population base of Rakhine was for thousands of years shared with Bengal, and that Burman immigrants from the Irrawaddy Valley began to move across the Rakhine Yoma in the early modern period, perhaps as early as 11th century, and in larger numbers as part of the wars between Inwa and Bago in the early 15th century. Afterwards, more immigrants were attracted to a Muslim Buddhist court in Rau from the 1430s. We know almost nothing about Burmese-speaking Theravada Buddhists in Rakhine before this time. Burmese language literature has a poem, the Rakhine myth Mie Jin from the early 15th century, which actually is connected to an Upper Burma princess planted in Rakhine. Inscriptions before this time are mainly in Devanagari, not in Burmese script. There is no real history, just history, created later on perhaps from myths and legends, but certainly not any recorded facts. In other words, we have very little evidence on either Muslim or Theravada Buddhist Burmese speakers in Rakhine before the early 15th century. From that time, the Mrau court was part of the Bay of Bengal world, circulated literati, military elites, and religious teachers throughout the region, and adopted a syncretic court culture that provided welcome home to both Muslims and to Buddhists. The dual religious identity of the court cemented its control over heavily Muslim Chittagong in the north and heavily Theravada Buddhist Thandwe in the south from the late 15th century. Probably everyone in Rakhine saw themselves as politically Rakhine, in political affiliation to the Mrau court. My view is that the Rohingya owe the emergence of their ethnicity not as much from these sources as from the tens of thousands of captives who were raided from Bengal and resettled and intermarried with local Rakhine in the Galadan River area from the 16th and particularly from the 17th century. The raids on Bengal for these captives is well documented. Some were sold to the Dutch, others sent to the Rakhine court to serve as Mudan, royal service people. Many others, perhaps most, were sent to form villages in the Galadan River area, where they opened up rice fields and produced the rice that the court then sold to the Dutch in the 17th century. Again, well documented. What we do not have are the detailed records of each individual who was taken, not because these records did not exist, but because they were burned by the Dutch as part of a clearance of old records in the 19th century. Again, well documented. By the mid-18th century, the population of Rakhine was estimated to be of 75% Bengal origin, that is, descended from these captives. Although many over the years would have died from malaria and other endemic diseases of the region, and others would flee from the Burman conquest and harsh rule from 1785, when British rule was extended over Rakhine in the 1820s, there were still an estimated 25,000 descendants of these captives left in Rakhine, 1/4 of the overall population. Many more were likely living across the Naf River in the Chittagong area from the later 1780s. When Francis Buchanan interviewed Rohingya here, they referred to themselves by that name, Rohingya, and argued that they and not the Burman residents in Rakhine at the time were the natives of Rakhine. My own idea, my own theory is that when they referred to themselves as Rakhine, or from Rakhine, they used the Bengali word for Rakhine that they carried with them to the region from the 15th century. And this, plus being a person from this area, came to be the Rohingya that we have today. At that time, both Rohingya and Rakhine meant being a native of Rakhine, depending on which dialect of language one used, and one had the peculiar culture, the peculiar material culture of their community that they saw as being the genuine Rakhine culture. The big irony is that many of the detractors will say that the British did not record them as Rohingya, but as Arakese Muslims, which is the historical foundation of what Rohingya probably means for most. In actuality, they are Rakhine who would define their ethnicity around their Muslim culture and called this Rohingya. There were also a smaller number of Hindus who also called themselves Rohingya and defined their ethnicity around their Hindu culture. This is the way that ethnicity is formed. Under the Burman administration from 1785 and the British administration from the mid-1820s, the Burmese language version of the ethnic referent was the one which was recorded. The Burmese version of this was the one that was recorded in the records. Probably many who call themselves at home Rohingya and some were probably Buddhist as well as Muslim, were recorded as being Rakhine in the records. In fact, later in the 19th century, the British authorities would tell their census takers in Rakhine to avoid recording local versions of names for population groups and just sort out everybody according to the prefix template that they had already put together on the basis of the rest of Burma and India. Rohingya as a referent gets erased from the Burma records and the way data was compiled, so that anyone who looks Indian was suddenly labeled as a foreign migrant. The Rohingya get labeled Chittagonian or Bengali or Arakanese Muslims at different times, but as cultivators in rural areas outside of the mainstream of colonial Burma, this meant that they lacked agency in colonial data collection and the colonial construction of knowledge. This task was left instead in the hands of British officials and Burmese subordinates who wanted administrative simplicity. More importantly, Western Orientalism had constructed knowledge about Burma to pigeonhole it and legitimate rule. Buddhist Burmese were under British rule because Buddhism, the religion, kept them focused on religion and not on industry, and thus unproductive economically. The British praised Muslims in Rakhine as hardworking, clever agriculturalists. It benefited the British to argue that the native Burmese, including the Rakhine, who were Buddhists, to claim that they were Buddhists because they then needed colonial guidance and management to make them economically productive. If the Rohingya, those Muslims speaking a dialect of Bengali, were the actual natives in parts of Rakhine, then British rule was actually unnecessary. Instead, if the Rohingya were depicted as foreign immigrants who came because of British rule and made the land productive, then this helped to legitimate the colonial project. Simplicity and legitimation of colonial rule through our colonization of knowledge about Burma meant that the Rohingya had to be foreign in colonial era. As part of British India, which until 1937 included Burma, the Rohingya looked at both emerging political discourses on Pakistan and Burma. There were certainly advocates of each. The communal problems, though, seem to have really been brought out in Rakhine by the chaos of the Japanese invasion in 1942 and the separation of different parts of the region between the British and the Japanese lines for much of the war. The administrative and colonial approach to knowledge about Rohingya, as I mentioned earlier, continued into the post-colonial period and into the Cold War because it served the construction of area studies knowledge about the world by the U.S. It was easier to cut up the world into numerous monolingual national states that could be won over from the communists like gambling chips than to deal with the full complexities of each political unit as constructed under colonial rule. So for all those Americans and British, were studying Myanmar, it was a Buddhist, Burmese-speaking country. All of it, historically, going well into the origins of the historical past, as well as the present. The Burmans, who exerted hegemony over Myanmar in 1948, agreed, but it was really the military takeover in 1962 that saw the government stepping towards full-fledged paradigms that excluded the Rohingya and others. History was rewritten along nationalist lines that promoted the military's role in history and portrayed it as a savior of the nation. Republishings of the Chronicles saw the military require that these rewrite the names of ethnic groups according to new official versions. The National Museum put up depictions of all of Myanmar's peoples that the military recognized and left others out. The military then went on to claim that the oldest human beings anywhere in the world were discovered in Myanmar. My view is that the people who have become the Rohingya are historically Rakhine, as much or more than other groups living in Rakhine. Once we drop Orientalist, colonial, Cold War, and nationalist constructions of knowledge, we find that the Rohingya have emerged as an ethnic group in the same way as most other ethnic groups in the country. Many were refugees or transplanted war captives. Groups like the Karen spoke scores of dialects until missionaries clarified these down to two. Who are the Mon? Are they the same as the Raman? Or as the groups who called themselves in the 19th century Abbasis? Or do we go to the Burmese word line, and do we accept their connection with European references to Paduan? Which group today is the Gwe, who were settled in areas around Inwa actually, and in areas that the Kachin are today in the 18th century and early, are the Thet, the Chakma. European accounts in the 19th century claim that the Rakhine Buddhists did not call themselves Rakhine, but rather refer to themselves as Marama. Indeed, we even have Marma, Chantha, Tantha, all of whom claim or could be claimed to be Rakhine Buddhists. The main point I would assert is that when you go picking through ethnicities in Myanmar to learn their history, a lot of the groundwork for everyone was done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Those who promote a Burman Buddhist identity as the natural state of the population of the country do not really understand that their identity too has undergone the same degree of invention, from heterogeneity to homogeneity, because they have been politically dominant for so long, before colonial rule and after colonial rule, and even held the position of the true native stock in the period in between. It is Burman records that have been preserved, Burmese language and Burmese versions of reference that are official, of ethnic reference that are official, their histories, mythologies that are preserved and seen as legitimate. They are standard. They suffer from the same blindness that comes out from what Matthew Walton has called Burman privilege. It is the same curse that has shaped the white privilege and colonial knowledge of the West. It is the same kind of pillar that, like that of Eurocentrism, needs to be toppled to move beyond the misimagined constructed world and see the world as it really is, or really should have been before the European conquest of the globe. So to come back to my initial proposition, how do we decolonize Rakhine history? As is the case with other ethnic races or minorities in Myanmar, this means rectifying the misconstructions of Oriental scholarship and neo-colonial scholarship. But it also means recognizing that in Myanmar, Burman constructions of knowledge work hand in hand with colonial authorities to produce a Myanmar that fit the Burman imaginary. The task at hand is also decolonizing the Burman imprint on knowledge about Myanmar and its peoples, its history, its culture, and its religion. It means holding Burmans to task and persuading them to recognize the Burman privilege they operate under on a daily basis at every level in the country. It also means restoring the wrongs done by Burman nationalism, particularly under the military dictatorship from 1962. How do we recover Rohingya history? We can look at the efforts of African Americans to recover their histories. Like those who have emerged as Rohingya, they too were forced to come to America as slaves, to work as cultivators for the profit of others. They were not treated as equal and were blocked by white nationalists from full political equality. They were attacked from organized anti-black white organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and suffered lynchings. If we substitute Rohingya for African American and Burman for white, we see what a struggle the Rohingya faced in Myanmar even before 2017. In the U.S., African Americans were also denied to have a history other than that as a footnote in an overwhelmingly white national narrative. Currently, and unfortunately, there are some who are working heavily to try to disprove the Rohingya have a history in the country. This distasteful practice would be very much like trying to claim that African Americans were not American because they were brought to the country as slaves. That because the latter were not originally recognized by the U.S. Constitution as citizens, they do not deserve to be citizens today. If we are going to recover Rohingya history, we will have to use the decolonization toolkit and apply it to Myanmar's history with a view towards a more inclusive history that recognizes the authoritative historical texts and records of Myanmar's past are merely the narrow reflections of a particular and privileged proto-ethnic and religious view on the country's past, and not a genuinely objective record. We will need to make the profession of history in Myanmar and about Myanmar more ethnically and gender inclusive, something we should have done. We should have actually done that today. We should have had a female Rohingya scholar as well, but maybe in the future. But I hope we will rectify this in the future. We will need to train Rohingya in a historical research method, fund historically reconstructive work on the Rohingya's past, and recognize that much of Rakhine's history is shared by the Rohingya, and not again the exclusive possession of one privileged ethnic and religious group in the region. We will need to recognize that all ethnicities in the country are equal parts historical and equal parts imaginary. All of them. We can only achieve this if we communicate with the Burman Buddhist historians on the need to eradicate bigotry in the Myanmar Academy. We will also need to question the very real existence of racism and Islamophobia in the Western Academy. That focuses on Myanmar and Theravada Buddhist studies. Now, my presentation has been shorter than 20 minutes, but I think that may, I'd like to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charney. That was really enlightening, and thank you to Mr. Nurul Islam. That was really good too. So now, Dr. Siddiqui, the floor is yours, and I know that you have a presentation to share.
Thank you, Regina. Can you see my screen?
Regina,
yes, you can.
Regina,
okay. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk on a subject of tremendous importance in our time. The topic that has been given to me to speak up is challenging Rakhine and military narratives about the Rohingyas of Myanmar. After hearing from both Nurul Islam and Professor Charney, I find myself in a very odd kind of position, in the sense that after hearing from them, there is nothing more probably to share. But nonetheless, given the fact that I have been chosen as a speaker, so I'm going to share some slides and trying to talk about oppression, marginalization, violence, and propaganda. None of it is new. What is new, however, in our time is the mere scale, the frequency, and omnipresence of disinformation, especially when it is propagated by a very powerful group that runs at the state level. To eliminate a targeted minority that is different by color, language, ethnicity, religion, customs, and culture, and everything. And nowhere in our time is this issue perhaps more acute than in Myanmar, where the project there has become a national project, which is enjoying support from the top rank to the lowest rank and the corner within the Buddhist society. From a military man in uniform to a monk in saffron robe, from a peasant in the paddy field to a politician working or wearing a lungi. The decades of disinformation campaigns against Rohingya people have robbed the persecuted, the Buddhist people, of its moral teachings about what defines our humanity and the values of compassion and empathy for a fellow human being. Even the R word, the shortcut for Rohingya, is a forbidden taboo in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi won't talk about it, won't utter it, nor would she allow or did allow any of our people to say the R word. To them, Rohingya is an invention that is concocted by Chittagonian Bengalis like myself to grab the Buddhist land. In so doing, these chauvinists forget the history of the geographical region that we commonly know today as South Asia and Southeast Asia has no one beginning, no one chronology, no single plot or narrative. And this fact has been recognized by great historians of the past and present. That includes Professor David Laden, Abdul Karim, Richard Eaton, Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, Juan Cole, and we have in our audience panel Dr. Charney, among many others, who spend their lifetime to study the region. To these unbiased historians of the ancient world, the region did not have a single history, but many histories with indefinite contested origins and with countless separate trajectories that multiply the more we learn about the region. Myanmar, bordering Bangladesh today, India, in the West, is no exception to that general group.
အဲ့ဒီတော့လူဦးရေဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်ကကူးလို့ဆက်ဆံမှုရှိရဆိုတာဒါက
Myanmar
အပေမဲ့အဲ့ဒါကို
has about 57 million people.
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာ
According to 2014 government census, about 54 million people, 51 million people. And of this, the majority comprise the Buddhist people, almost 88%, according to the CIA fact book. And the Burman race who run the country, they comprise almost 2/3 of the population. There are 135 ethnic races that are recognized, of which obviously Rohingya don't belong. They're part of probably 140 or more races that live in that country. Denied citizenship since 1982 because they are considered as aliens or influx viruses, something that should be wiped out. So they have been totally discounted. The history of Burma has changed. It is now called Myanmar. Various territories, the states, have been also renamed. The Arakan is a Rakhine state because obviously Rakhine people are the majority.
ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာရခိုင်လူမျိုးတွေကတော့ယခုလက်ရှိမှာလူများစုအဖြစ်တည်ရှိနေပါတယ်
The Rohingyas have been victims of genocide since at least 1942, and you have already heard Nurul Islam Bhai to talk about that.
Nurul Islam အခုနပြောခဲ့ပြီးပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့96မှာလဲ
I want to just share some of the speeches and writings from the people within Burma as to how they prepared the people for the ultimate execution of the genocidal program.
ပုံဖြတ်စွာနဲ့လေ့လာမှုတွေကိုလုပ်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Burmese Consulate General Im Min Aung very famously said a few years ago, more than a decade ago, that the Rohingyas are as ugly as ogres. Interestingly, such highly offensive, derogatory remarks didn't hurt his career. He was appointed as the ambassador to Switzerland. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who runs the country since February of this year, he famously said that Rohingyas are the Bengalis who do not have the characteristics of culture in common with the ethnicities of Myanmar. Wirathu, who has been called the Buddhist Bin Laden, has been using the term Khalad, a very offensive kind of term, very much similar to the leaders that are used against the Afro-Americans brought to America. When he was asked, is it possible that the Buddhist people and especially the soldiers had raped the Rohingya women? He said it is impossible because the Rohingyas are not beautiful enough. Their bodies are too disgusting. And he, by the way, is not alone in making those kind of highly offensive remarks about people that have been marginalized, that are victims of genocide. One of the MPs, elected MPs in Rakhine, he said in an interview with BBC journalist Aung Win that Rohingyas are too dirty, their women are too dirty, and so there is no way any Buddhist man or soldier would be tempted to rape Rohingya women. To many Buddhists living in Arakan and also in Burma, the Rohingyas have been described as the terrorists or extremists. One of their academics who have made a living out of selling bigotry, Dr. Aichan, who himself finds himself as an academic in Japan, a foreign country, calls the Rohingyas influx virus that should be wiped out. Another Buddhist extremist, King Mongso, says that Rohingya infiltration in Burma and especially in Arakan is more like a camel in a famous Burmese story about a camel that tried to dislodge its owner. So unless the Burmese and the Rakhine people wake up, the Chittagoni and Bengalis are going to take over their place, just like that camel in that Burmese fable. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who is the de facto leader, in September 2017, he said that we have to finish what was left unfinished back in 1942 during the Second World War. And we'll get into what did happen in Second World War, and you have already heard something from our two scholars in the panel. Since 2012, and this, by the way, is not the beginning. In my count, it is probably the 20th and the later kind of incidents of the genocidal programs that the Rohingyas have been facing. Hundreds of houses and villages have been burned, people have been killed, and there is no pain to their suffering. Here is a picture taken by Reuters, and you could see what has happened in a Rohingya neighborhood in Mongdong, which is close to the border in Bangladesh. Their homes and everything were burned down. This is a picture from 2012, before and after, that shows, how the entire community has been wiped out. Same thing in 2017, burned down villages. And this is what they have been doing to erase the very identity of the Rohingya people. Denied each and every one of the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Rohingyas are described, and rightly so, as the most persecuted people in our time, in our planet. Since August 25, 2017, according to a report prepared by Ontario International Development Agency, nearly 24,000 Rohingyas have been killed by Myanmar's state forces, while more than 34,000 were thrown into the fires. Over 114,000 homes, over 114,000 people were beaten, as many as 18,000 women and girls as young as even 7 years old. They were raped, and at least 115,000 homes were burned down. At the heart of the issue, the Rohingya crisis, is the question about the Rohingya origin. And we'll look into some of the claims that you have already heard about, the Rohingya claims.
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေဘက်ကနေပြီးတော့ပြောတာကိုလည်းကြည့်
The
ဖို့လိုပါတယ်
Rohingyas believe
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေ
very
ကဘာပြော
strongly
ကြလဲ
and
ဆိုရင်
probably rightly
တိ
so.
ကျကျကိုသူတို့ပြောပါတယ်
They are
တကယ်လည်းမှန်ပါတယ်
the
သူတို့က
descendants
ဘာပြောကြလဲ
of
ဆိုရ
the
င်
first settlers to the coastal territory of Arakan.
ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်
History
ဒေ
has
သ
shown
ရဲ့
that before
ပင်လ
the
ယ်ကြီးကျောင်းဒေသ
Tibeto-Mongoloid people
ခံ
moved
ယူတန်ဒေ
into
သတွေ
the
မှာပထမ
territory
ဦးဆုံး
of
အခြေချ
today's
နေထိုင်ခဲ့သူတွေက
Arakan or
တို့
Rakhine
ပါလို့
state,
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေက
there
ကြွေး
were
ကြော်
the
ကြပါတယ်
Indian origin people being very close to Bengal or Bangladesh on the other side of the Naf
တ
River
မိုင်းကိုပြန်
that
ပြီးတော့ကြည့်
separate
မယ်ဆိုရင်
today's
လည်းအိန္ဒိယ
Myanmar
တိုက်ကြီး
from
ဆိုပြီးတော့
Burma.
ရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
It
အဲ့ဒီ
is
အိန္ဒိယတိုက်ကြီး
highly
ရဲ့အနီး
possible
ဆက်
and
ဆုံး
credible
နေရာက
that
ဒီ
they
ဘက်က
have
ယခု
been
လက်ရှိမြေပေါ်
living
မှာ
there
ရှိနေတဲ့ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်
since
ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
time
အဲ့ဒီ
immemorial.
မှာဆိုရင်ဟိန္ဒူဘာသာကိုကိုးကွယ်တဲ့အိန္ဒိ
They
ယ
also
နိုင်ငံ
claim
တွေကအ
that
စ
the
င်တစိုက်
Rohingya
နေထိုင်
language
ခဲ့
and
ကြသူတွေဖြစ်
culture
ပါတ
was
ယ်အိန္ဒိယ
dominant,
ငွေခွားတွေ
especially
နဲ့
during
တား
the
အကြောင်းလူ
Moroccan
မျိုးတူတဲ့သူ
dynasty
တွေနေထိုင်
from
တဲ့
the
ဒေသက
15th
ယ
to
ခု
the
လက်ရှိ
18th
ရခိုင်
century.
ပြည်နယ်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီတော့ပြန်ကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့
And as
ရို
you
ဟင်ဂျာဘာသာစ
recognize
ကားနဲ့ယဉ်ကျေးမှု
that
ကရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာ
Moroccan dynasty
အောက်လျှောက်လွှမ်းမိုးခဲ့ပါ
was
တယ်
brought into power with the help of Muslim
dynasty
Sultan
ကဆိုရင်
Jalaluddin Muhammad Shah
ဂျလာလူဒင်မိုဟာ
in
မက်ရှာလို့
1430.
ခေါ်တဲ့
Moromahla or
ဘုရင်
Minsomon
ကြီး
was put into
မွတ်စ
power
လင်
with
ဘု
the
ရင်ကြီး
aid
ရဲ့
of
ထောက်ပံ့ကိုယူပြီးတော့
50,000
ရခိုင်တွေကနန်း
Muslim
တက်အုပ်ချုပ်နေ
soldiers
ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
that came from
ပြီးတော့
Muslim Bengal and other
မွ
parts
တ်စလင်
of
စစ်သားတစ်
Muslim
သောင်းခွဲလောက်က
dominated India
ရ
in
ခိုင်
two
ဘုရင်
groups,
ကို
one under the leader of
ဖန်ဖိုးပေးခဲ့ပါတ
under
ယ်
the leadership of
သူ့
General
နိုင်ငံ
Wali
ကိုဝင်လာ
Khan
တဲ့
and
သူ့ဒေသကို
later
ဝင်လာတဲ့ကျူး
General
ကျော်သူတွေကို
Sandhi
တို
Khan.
က်ထုတ်ပေးပြီးတော့သူ့ကိုနန်းတင်ပေးခဲ့ပါတယ်
And
ဘိုးတော်
most
ဘု
of
ရား
them,
ခင်မှာဘိုးတော်ဘုရားရဲ့ကျူးကျော်မှုတွေ
they
အင်္ဂစား
settled
ဒီ
in
မှာဒီ
Arakan.
ကျွန်တော်တို့
They became basically the vanguards of the regime.
လူဦးရေရဲ့သုံးပုံတစ်ပုံကမွတ်စလင်တွေဖြစ်
In
ခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီအ
1784,
ချိန်မှာ
that territory
အ
was
ရှိအိန္ဒိယကုမ္ပဏီကထိုဒေသကို
by
1826 မှာသိမ်းပြီးပါပြီအဲ့ဒီအချိန်မှာဆိုရင်လည်းရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေကဗြိတိရှတွေရဲ့လက်အောက်ခံဖြစ်
during
သွား
which
ကြ
much
ခိုင်ဒီ
sabotage,
လက်အောက်ခံဖြစ်သွားတယ်လို့ဗြိတိရှ
much
တွေလည်းဗြိတိ
pogroms
ရှတွေရဲ့လက်အောက်
happened
ခံကရိုဟင်ဂျာ
not
တွေဖြစ်
only
ခဲ့ပါတ
against
ယ်
the Muslims
ဒုတိယကမ္ဘာစစ်
that
မှာလည်း
lived
ရိုဟ
there,
င်ဂျာ
but
တွေက
also
လူ
the
မျိုးတုံး
Rakhine
ရှင်းလင်း
Buddhists
ခြင်းကို
that
ခံ
lived
ခဲ့ရ
there.
ပါတယ်အာရကန်ဒေသမှာဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်1940နဲ့45မှာဂျပန်
During
တွေ
World
ကျူး
War
ကျော်လာတဲ့အချိန်
II,
မှာခန်းစားခဲ့ရပါတယ်
the
အဲ့
ethnic
ဒီမှာဆိုရင်
cleansing
သူတို့တွေက
program
မြောက်ပိုင်း
pushed
ကိုမောင်း
the
ထုတ်ခြင်းခံ
Rohingyas
ခဲ့ရပါတယ်သူတို့ရဲ့
living
တောင်
in the
ပိုင်းဒေသ
south
တွေကနေ
to
မောင်းထုတ်
move
ခံခဲ့ရတာဖြစ်ပါတ
up
ယ်
to the north,
အဲ့တော့ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေက
settling mostly in the Mayu frontier region, very close to
ဒေသမှာ
today's
အဲ့ဒီ
Bangladesh.
မှာစုပြုံပြီးတော့နေထို
And
င်နေရပါတယ်
Rohingyas have every right
ဒီဘက်ကြောင့်
to
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေက
self-identify
သူ
themselves
တို့ကိုသူ
in
တို့
whatever way they want to self-identify themselves.
သူတို့ကိုကိုဘယ်
It's a
ပုံစံ
right
နဲ့
that they should have
ခေါ်
and
ဆို
must
ခြင်း
have.
ခံခြင်းတလဲကိုသူတို့လုံနိုင်ပါတယ်လုံလဲလုံတင်ပါတယ်
Here is a document
Di ma
about
so yin,
showing,
so
that
yeah.
nationality
မှတ်တမ်းတွေဖြ
of
စ်
the
ပါတယ်
Rohingya people, and they were
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေ
recognized as such.
ကိုဒီမှာ
that
အတိအမှတ်ပြုထားတဲ့
they
မှတ်တ
are
မ်းမှတ်ရတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
they are from
ဒီထဲမှာဆိုရ
Myanmar,
င်ကျွန်တော်တို့
and
တွေ
it
က
was recognized, but although changed in
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာ
1982.
အတိ
The
အမှတ်ပြု
Rakhine
ခဲ့တဲ့နေရာ
claims
တွေကဟိုးအရင်
is
ကရှိပါ
obviously
တယ်ဒါပေမဲ့
quite
1960
different, and you have seen a whole bunch of examples
Government
in the
Dimara
first
Rakhine-
couple of slides.
ဒေသခံ
They
တွေပြောတာ
considered
ရခိုင်တိုင်းရ
the
င်းသားတွေ
Rohingya
ပြော
is
တာ
not
က
a
ကြတော့ပုံစံမ
nationality
တူ
in
ပါဘူး
Myanmar.
သူတို့ကဘာ
They
ပြောလဲဆို
cannot
ရင်
accept them because
Rohingya တွေက
Rohingyas
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံသားတွေမ
are
ဟုတ်ဘူး
foreigners,
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေက
aliens,
နိုင်ငံသားတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
outsiders, and
တခြား
they
တိုင်း
are
ပြည်က
out
လာတဲ့
here
သူတွေဖြစ်တယ်
to
တ
grab
ခြားက
the
ဘာက
Buddhist
လာတဲ့
life.
သူတွေဖြစ်တယ်လို့တော့ပြောကြတဲ့သူတွေရှိပါတ
They
ယ်ဗုဒ္ဓ
also
ဘာသာ
claim
တိုင်းပြည်ကိုတိမ့်ပို့လာတဲ့သူတွေလည်းဖြစ်ပါတယ်
You know
အဲဒီတော့သူတို့က
that
ဘာထီတောင်ပြောလဲဆိုတော့
Rohingyas were a very
Rohingya
small
တွေက
percentage
ဒီမတန်
before
တော့ဘူး
the
လူဦးရေနည်းပါ
British
တယ်
moved in.
ဗြိတိရှတွေမလာခင်တုန်းကဆိုရင်သူတို့အင်တာမနည်းနည်းလေးပဲရှိတယ်
And
လို့
that
ပြောပါတယ်
It was the
အဲ့ဒီ
British
မှာဘာပြောလဲဆိုရင်ဗြိတိရှတွေ
beginning in
က
1826 who brought large number of
Asia.
Chittagonians from
16ခုနှစ်မှာ
British ruled
စစ်တ
Bengal
ကောင်းဒေသက
to
လူ
move
တွေ
to the other side of the
Oh.
border. Obviously in those days there was
တ
no
ခြား
border
တစ်ဖက်ကို
between today's
ပို့ခဲ့ကြတယ်
Myanmar
လို့
and
ပြောဆိုဆွဆွဲ
Bangladesh,
ကြပါတယ်
especially
ဗြိတိရှ
after
တွေ
the
ခေါ်လာ
last
လို့ရောက်
war
လာတဲ့
in
သူတွေတယောင်
1885.
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေကိုပုံ
But
ဖော်ကြ
anyway,
ပါတယ်
that is their
ဒါ
theory.
ပေမဲ့မိတို့ပင်ဆိုစေကမှုဒါကသူတို့ရဲ့ပြောကြားချက်တွေတာလေးဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီ
And
ပုံကိုကြည့်လိုက်မယ်
as
ဆို
we
ရင်
have seen,
သင်္ကား
and
ပြတွေဖြစ်
history
ပါတယ်
and historians have shown and have collected coins and other
ဒီမှာ
things
ရှိတဲ့
that
သင်္ကားပြ
shows
တွေကဟိုး
rather
ရှိတုန်းကမြော
in
က်ဦး
contrast
ဘရင်နိုင်ငံမှာအ
that
သုံးပြု
the
တဲ့သင်္
kings
ကား
of
ပြတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Arakan,
အဲ့ဒါတွေက
the
လုံးဝ
Morocco
ကိုအခုနဲ့ပြောတဲ့သူတွေနဲ့ခြေမြင့်မရှိတဲ့စကားတွေနဲ့ နာနာ
minted
ကြီး
the coins
အဆက်ပါဘူး
that had
ဒီ
the
သင်္ကားပြ
Islamic
တွေက
testimony
အစ္စလာမ်
of
ဘာ
faith.
သာဝင်တွေရဲ့
La ilaha illallah
ကြွေးကြော်မှု
Muhammad
ဖြစ်တဲ့ယုံ
Rasulullah.
ကြည်ချက်ကိုအာရဗီလိုရေးထိုးထားတဲ့သင်္ကားပြတွေကိုမြောက်ဦးခေတ်
Is
မြောက်
it
ဦးဘရင်
possible
နိုင်ငံ
they
မှာအသုံးပြု
became
တဲ့သင်္ကား
Muslim
ပြ
or
တွေ
they
ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
just
အဲ့ဒီတော့ဒါကြီးက
pretended
ဘာကိုပြလဲ
to
ဆိုရင်မွတ်စလင်တွေကလေယုံကြည်တဲ့ မွတ်စလင်
Muslim or
တွေရဲ့ယုံ
something
ကြည်
like
ချက်
that?
ကို
That is a debatable
သင်္ကား
thing,
ပြမှာထိုး
and
ဖို့ဆိုရင်
the
တခြား
scholars
နို
are
င်ငံ
divided,
ကဘယ်နိုင်ငံကမှလက်ခံမှာမ
and
ဟုတ်ပါ
but
ဘူး
I won't go
အဲ့တော့ဒါ
there.
ကဘာပြောချင်တာလဲဆိုရင်မြောက်ဦးခေ
But
တ်
the fact
မှာ
is
ဒီလိုမျိုးသင်္ကားပြ
that
တွေကိုအသုံးပြုရ
Islam
ခြင်း
had a
က
very strong
ဒီဒေသရဲ့
influence
ပင်ရ
in
င်းနေ
Arakan
ထိုင်တဲ့
that
သူတွေက
cannot be denied.
အာရကန်မှာနေထိုင်တဲ့သူတွေကမွတ်စလင်တွေကရှေးကတည်းက
Even
နေထို
before
င်
the
ခဲ့ကြတယ်
British came,
ပင်ရင်းဌာနေတိုင်းရင်း
there
သား
are
တွေရှိ
records,
ခဲ့တယ်ဆိုတာငင်းလို့မရပါဘူး
British
မွတ်စလင်တွေရဲ့လွှမ်းမိုးမှုက
records,
လည်းအာရကန်မှာ
and
ကြီး
I'm
မားခဲ့ပါတယ်
sharing
အစ္စ
couple
လာမ်
of these here in
ဘာ
the
သာရေးလွှ
bottom
မ်းမိုးမှုက
from
အင်မတန်
Major
ကိုကြီး
Roberts
ခဲ့ပါတယ်
and Francis Buchanan.
ဗမာနိုင်ငံ
One is about
1984
some,
မှာ
50 years before the British
1886 မှာ
moved in,
ဒီ
and another is
ကိုလိုနီ
nearly
ခေတ်ကို
25
ခင်
some
မှာ
years before the
အ
British
စ္စလာမ်ဘာ
moved
သာ
in.
ရဲ့လွှမ်းမိုးမှုက
That
အာရကန်
there
တွေက
were a
ပြည့်ပြန့်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
sizable amount of people who were probably Muslims, who were, the forefathers of today's Rohingya.
ကျွန်တော်တို့
Even
က
the name
ဒီမှာပြန်
Rohingya
တွေ့
was
ရမှာဆိုရိုဟင်ဂျာဆိုတဲ့စကားလုံး
in
ကိုယ်တိုင်
vogue
က
there. Okay?
Karen
So this
Soin,
was not an
ဒီ
invention.
ဘင်္ဂါလီတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေဘင်္
During
ဂါလီ
Gupta Priya's
လူ
rule,
တွေရဲ့ကြပြတွေမှာ
hundreds of
ရိုဟင်ဂျာ
thousands
ဆို
of
ပြီးတော့စကားလုံးကပါဝင်
people,
ခဲ့တာ
almost
ကိုတွေ့ရမှာဖြစ်
2/3
ပါတယ်
of the people
So, Bengali
were forced to migrate
ကြပြမှာပါဝင်
to
တဲ့ရိုဟင်ဂျာ
Chittagong
တွေဆိုတာက
in
ဘင်္ဂါလီတွေက
Bengal.
ကိုယ့်ကိုယ်ကို
That
ခေါ်
was
တဲ့
ruled
အရာ
under
မဟုတ်
the
ပါဘူး
British rule.
တခြားလူမျိုးတွေကိုခေါ်တာပါဒီ
That
လူ
was
တွေက
under the
အစ္စလာမ်
British
ဘာသာကိုကိုးကွယ်ကြပါတယ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ရေးသား
During
ထား
the
ပါတယ်
Second
ငါ
World
တို့ရဲ့
War, yes, something
Bana
definitely
Tudelu
happened,
Shiba
and
Chana,
that is very
Tuyabari.
worrisome.
အဲ့ဒီတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီရကဘာစစ်ကိုပြန်
Burmese
ကြည့်ပြီးဆို
people
ရင်လေ
collaborated with the
ဗ
fascist
မာ
Japanese
လူမျိုးတွေ
forces,
က
while the Rohingya
ဂျ
Muslims,
ပန်တွေနဲ့ပေါင်းခဲ့
they
ပါတယ်ရိုဟ
collaborated
င်
with
ဂျာ
the
မွတ်စလင်
British.
တွေကတော့ဗြိတိရှတွေနဲ့အတူတူ
And
ပူးပေါင်း
when
ခဲ့ပါတယ်
Japan
ဒီတဲ့
occupied
အခါမှာဂျပန်က
Burma,
ဗမာနိုင်ငံ
especially
ကို
Arakan,
သိမ်းခဲ့ပါတယ်
and
အာရကန်ဒေ
Muslims
သ
were
သူတစ်
massacred.
ဖြင့်သိမ်းခံခဲ့ရ
Tens
ပါတယ်
of
မွတ်စလင်တွေ
thousands of Muslims were
သိမ်းနဲ့
massacred,
ခြေပြီးတော့ဖတ်ဖြတ်ခြင်းခံ
294
ခဲ့ရ
villages
ပါတ
were
ယ်
destroyed. And these are all part of
ရွာ
history.
ပေါင်း
Nobody can
94
deny that.
ရွာလောက်ဖျက်ဆီးခြင်းခံရပါတယ်ဒါကသမိုင်းမှတ်တမ်းပါ
Other thing is obviously, yes,
ရွာပေါင်း
British did
294ရွာ
encourage
ဖျက်ဆီးခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်
the
အဲ့ဒါပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာတော့
repatriation of those Arakanese
တိုက်တဲ့အတွက်
Muslims
ဂျ
and
ပန်တွေ
Bengal
ပြန်ပြေးရပါတယ်
Muslims and Buddhists to come
အဲ့
back.
ဒီမှာ
But not
Buddha
everybody
Bhagavad
moved in.
Gita,
There are a
Muslim
lot of
Gita,
Rakhines living
Gita,
in Cox's Bazar and Chittagong. If you were to go, you will find
ရ
that.
ခိုင်တော်တော်များများကအဲ့ဒီတော့ကချက်တကောင်းမှာလည်းနေထိုင်ပြီးသားဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေကပြန်မလာခဲ့ပါဘူး
Quite a few
ဒီ
people
နိုင်ငံ
moved
တွေကို
in. But
ဒါပေမဲ့တော်တော်များများတွေ
according
ပြန်
to
လာ
the
ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
census
အကုန်လုံးမဟုတ်
or
ပါ
some
ဘူး
kind of, record that Charles
ကျွန်
Patton
တော်တို့မှတ်
had,
တမ်းတွေအရ
30% of
ပြ
the
န်ကြည့်မယ်
people
ဆိုရင်
in Arakan
30%
State, when the British
တော့
moved in,
လူ
were
တွေက
Muslims,
ဗြိတိရှ
distinctly
တွေ
Muslims,
ခင်ပါလေမွတ်
30%.
စလင်တွေပါပဲ
So it is no
မွတ်စလင်က
accident
30%
when in
အထက်ရှိခဲ့ပါတ
1911
ယ်
the census was taken, the Muslims became
1917မှာလည်း
33% of the
မွတ်စလင်
population.
တွေကအဲ့ဒီလူဦးရေ33ရာခိုင်
I
နှု
think
န်း
I
ရှိတယ်
went over my time slot of 20
အ
minutes.
ခုအချိန်
But
တွေ
what
က
I wanted
အ
to
ချိန်
get
ကန
at
ည်းတဲ့အတွက်
is,
ကျွန်တော်တို့ပြောချင်တာကတော့
the statements or the kind of narratives put by the other side, they
ခြား
are
တစ်ဖက်ကလူ
totally
တွေ
false.
ဆွဆွဲလို
And
မျိုး
they cannot
ပြော
be
ကြားချက်တွေက
simply,
ဘယ်တော့မှမှန်ကန်မှု
supported
မရှိတာ
in
ကို
any
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့ပြောချင်တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
And it is the greatest shame of
ပ
our
ထမ
time
ဦးဆုံးမြ
when
မ
we
သ
let,
မိုင်းမှာလက်
for
နက်ချ
example,
လင်းဝင်ခဲ့တဲ့
the
အဖွဲ့ကလည်းရိုဟင်
narratives
ဂျာ
of
တွေ
some
ပဲဖြစ်
bigots
ပါတယ်
to
ဆိုတာကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်
dominate
ထပ်လောင်းပြောချင်ပါတယ်ဒီပုံထဲမှာဆိုရင်မြေယူဒေတာမှာ
everything
ငင်း
that
ချမ်း
we
ရေး
hear.
ရပြီဆို
Thank
ပြီး
you
တော့
for listening.
ရေးသားထားပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါက
Thank
လေ
you
ရို
so
ဟင်
much,
ဂျာတွေလက်နက်ချ
Dr.
တာကိုရေး
Siddiqui.
သားတာဖြစ်
So
ပါတယ်
right now we
ကျွန်တော်ဒီမှာ
have
ဒီ
some
ဆုံးသက်ချင်ပါတ
questions
ယ်ခင်
for
ဗျ
the panelists.
အခုဒီမှာ
And I'm
ပြော
going to
ကြားသွား
start
သူ
some
တွေ
of
ကို
these
မေးဖြေကဏ္
look
ဍရှိပါ
similar,
ပြီ
so I will try
အခု
to
ကျွန်မအနေနဲ့မေးခွန်း
them
တွေအ
together in
ချို့
a way
ကို
that'll make sense.
စူးစီးပြီးတော့
So one of
panelist
the
တွေကိုပေး
first
ပေးပါ
question
မယ်
actually
ပ
relates
ထမဆုံးမေး
to
ခွန်းတစ်ခုက
something
တော့
that took place after 2017 and is
ဒီ
reported.
မှာ
I'm sure all of the
2019
panelists are familiar
နှစ်
with
နောက်
it.
ပိုင်းမှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တာကို
Arno
ပြောချင်
actually
တာ
did
ဖြစ်ပါ
some
တယ်
work around this,
အဲ့ဒီ
so
မှာ
whoever's interested can look at the Rohingya web. Rohingya.org is the website on the MIMU, M-I-M-U. But the question is about, does the renaming of Rohingya villages now,
အဲ့ဒီမှာပါရေးထားလို့ဆို
is
တော့
that proof of the intent to destroy, or proof to
ရိုဟင်ဂျာ
destroy
တွေ
the
ရဲ့
Rohingya
ပေါ့လေ
people? Does it add to the Rohingya, the genocide cases that are being brought forward? And how would all three of you respond to the renaming of Rohingya villages, the destruction of the mosques,
အခုရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေ
particularly
ရဲ့
those that are
ရွာ
very
တွေကဖျက်
ancient
ဆီး
and
ခံ
have
လို
been
က်ရ
in
ပြီ
the Arakan
ဖြစ်နိုင်
for
တာ
some
က
time?
တော့ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေရဲ့ရွာတွေကလည်းမရှိတော့ဘူးရှိမယ်ဆိုရင်လည်းရွာတွေကိုလည်းနဲ့အ
Do you want us to raise hands or?
ဒီကိစ္စကို
go
ဘယ်လို
ahead,
ဖြေ
yeah.
ရှင်းဖို့
Oh, okay.
ရှိပါတယ်လဲ
No, I think that fits a general pattern of genocide. So they're being erased from the local environment.
genocide ပဲဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျဒီဟာကတသက်ကိုလူမျိုးတုံးတက်ဖြတ်မှုကိုကျူးလွန်ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Yes, I agree with Dr. Charney.
ကျွန်တော်လည်းဒေါက်တာချာနီနဲ့
Because one of the ways that you wipe
အဲ့တော့
out
ပထမဦးဆုံးကဘာ
identity
လဲ
of
ဒီ
a
လိုမျိုး
people
လူတွေ
is
ရဲ့
through
တည်ရှိမှု
whatever
ကို
is
ဖိ
dear
ထုတ်
to
လိုက်တယ်
their
ဗျာအဲ့ဒါ
heart.
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာ
And
သူ
so
တို့တွေက
those
ဘာပဲ
kind
လုပ်
of
လို့
cultural things like, you know,
သူတို့တွေရဲ့
mosque and
တည်
whatever
ရှိမှုက
they have,
ဖျက်ဆီး
that
ခြင်း
is
ခံ
part of
ရ
the
ရတယ်
history.
အဲ့
So
ဒီ
there
တော့
has
သမိုင်း
been
ကို
a
တော့
systemic
ဖျောက်လို့တော့မရဘူး
program
ပေါ့နော်
to
တေချာတာကတော့
demolish. And that's why we don't have that, you
တိ
know,
တိကျကျ
famous
ကိုဒီ
mosque
လူ
of
တွေကိုဖျက်ဆီး
Sandikan
ခြင်းနဲ့
that
ရွေးချက်နဲ့
dates
ဖျက်
back
ဆီး
to
ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
1430s.
အဲ့တော့ဒီမှာ
The historical mosque is gone, and there are several others, you know, in various parts of Arakan.
အဲ့ဒီတော့အာရကန်ဒေ
In
သမှာ
olden
ပလီ
days,
တီ
there
အများ
would be
ကြီးရှိတယ်
hundreds of
အဲ့ဒီ
mosques
ပလီ
and
တီ
other
က
kind of, you know, madrasas
နှစ်
that
ရာ
would
နဲ့
be
ချီပဲရှိတဲ့ဘာသာရေးစာတင်ကြောင်းတွေပလီတီတွေ
everywhere
အဲ့ဒီပလီတီ
from
ကို
north
ပါ
to
စနစ်တ
south
ကျ
of
ဖျက်ဆီး
Arakan.
ခဲ့တာကိုကြည့်
They
ချင်
have
အ
been
ဖြစ်
totally wiped out.
တမိုင်းလက်ရာတွေကိုဖျောက်တယ်ဒီလူတွေရဲ့တည်ရှိမှုကိုဖျောက်ချင်
Mr.
တဲ့
Islam, do you
ရွေး
have
ချက်လုပ်
anything
ခဲ့
you
တာ
want to
လို့
add?
ပဲကျွန်တော်ပြောချင်ပါတယ်မစ္စတာအစ္စလမ်ကိုဘာပြောချင်ပါလဲ
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
မစ္စတာအစ္စလမ်က
You have to unmute.
You're on mute. You're on mute. You're
You
on
have to
mute.
unmute. He's talking. Unfortunately, I don't think he's.
Neural, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Neural. Go.
You have to unmute yourself. Okay, we have to let go of him.
Yeah. Okay, I think you got it. Yes.
Can you unmute? No.
Ronnie, can you unmute him, please? Wait, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you hear.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good.
Go ahead.
This is completely a Burmese design. This is a state policy to wipe out the Rohingya from Arakan. And then the last one, what happened in 2017, 2012, 2017, completely eliminated the Rohingya people.
So in following up on those answers that you all gave, one of the other questions that was asked was about UNESCO. And do you feel that they would have a role to play in protecting the cultural identity in the Arakan, and can they do that effectively?
But they should, but it might be too late. If we look at archaeological records in the 19th century, the reported archaeological survey of Burma and the Forschermer's account of Rakhine and so on, there were, in some of the Buddhist temples, there were Persian motifs and this kind of thing that were eradicated. And we know that if we go back 20 years ago, when Myanmar came in and was interested in developing Rakhine as a tourist site, they started to rebuild a lot of the temples, not according to indigenous design, but according to the patterns that they saw for Burman temples, Buddhist temples in the Irrawaddy Valley. And we know that the Sandakan Mass that was destroyed a while ago, and I just don't know what they're going to preserve now that they bulldozed all these villages. What is there left for? Because UNESCO doesn't go out and restore what's been destroyed. They preserve what remains. And a lot of politicians, if I can just add one more thing, this is the purpose, is that politicians will then tell, religious communalists will then tell contemporary Rakhine, how could there be Muslims in our history? How could there be Rohingya? Look around you, there's no mosque, there's no this, there's no that. Yeah, because you bulldozed everything.
Mr. Islam or Dr. Siddiqui, is there anything you want to add?
I agree with Professor Charney. You cannot go back to something that has been already wiped out, right? That is hopeless case. There is still something the world should have waked up to the genocidal process that we have been talking about for decades. I remember back in 2001 when I first got interested about the Arakan history. And shamefully for me, because I grew up in Chittagong, a Chittagonian by that definition. And since my college days in early 1980s in America, I've written about a lot of people, vulnerable people, in various parts of the world, without even trying to understand about the sufferings of the very people that lived next door, the Rohingyas. But already signs were there as to how they are facing genocide. And as we have said, and scholars have said, genocide is not an outcome that we wait for. Genocide people has been wiped out. No, it's a process. And it goes through various stages. Some of them might go in parallel, some might be in sequence. Signs were always out there. Even the Bangladesh government didn't pay attention. I remember, back in 2007, speaking with the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh, Tawhid Hussain. And he and I went to the same cadet college in Bangladesh. But he said, well, Habib Bhai, if you were to take care of this Rohingya people, the whole entire Rohingya community is going to move away from Arakan and settle in Bangladesh. But we cannot let that happen. Bangladesh is not resourceful. It's a poor country. These were the excuses. In 2012, the same thing happened again. There were signs of, yes, it is happening. And everybody was waiting. Let's see. Now that another million people have moved into Bangladesh, people have taken the notice. We always try to react rather than trying to stop when we could have done a better job. And that is a sad commentary.
I want to transition to the colonial period, so to speak, because I think the history of Burma before British colonialism and after, there's a lot of different kind of environments that were created. So, Mr. Islam, I want to start with you, and I want to speak about something that I don't think is talked about enough when it comes to the Rohingya situation. But what do you think is the responsibility of what is now known as the United Kingdom, but back then would have been Britain, in what we're seeing play out today in Burma, and especially with the Rohingya people? Do you feel that there's anything that they should be doing more of, or do they have an important something that they need to step up to do, given the colonial history?
Long time. During the colonial period, as Brother Siddiqui had mentioned, the Rohingya people, they participated, and then the British has given assurance that the rights and freedom will be ensured, and even to the extent that the Rohingya will be statehood of their own in Arakan, even the part of the northern Arakan as the Muslim area of North Arakan. So in spite of that, while the British were leaving from Burma, even they have not introduced the issue of the Rohingya people to the Burmese leaders, nor have introduced to the British Parliament. This is one thing. The second thing is there was a conflict during the 1970s, the colonial period. There was misunderstanding happened between the Rohingya and the Rakhine community, the two major peoples of Arakan. Even before that, before the 1942 they live together in Sharon Caroline in peaceful
ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်ဒီလူတွေရဲ့အချင်းချင်းကြားထဲမှာသဟဇာတချစ်ကြည်မှုရှိအောင်ကူညီပေးတင်တယ်လို့အကြံပြုချင်ပါတယ်ရိုဟင်ဂျာကိုရခိုင်ကိုတကယ်တမ်းဆိုညီနောင်တွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေကအတူတူနေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြသူတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်ယခုလည်းအတူတူနေထိုင်ပါတယ်နောက်လည်းအတူတူနေထိုင်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်အဲ့တော့ဒီတွေကတွေးခွဲအုပ်ချုပ်ခြင်းတွေကိုခဏခဏခံခဲ့ရတဲ့သူတွေဒါလည်းဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်ဒီလူတွေရဲ့အခြေအနေကိုကောင်းမွန်အောင်လုပ်ဖို့ဆိုရင်ဒီလူတွေအချင်းချင်းကြားထဲမှာသဟဇာတဖြစ်လာမဲ့အရာတွေကိုပို့ပြီးတော့လုပ်ပြီးပါလို့ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့တောင်းဆိုချင်ပါတယ်နောက်တစ်ခုကကြတော့
in a systematic and plan way even they given in started the legitimization the process of the legitimization and at the same time and persecution and to the extent that now genocide happened. This way gradually Rohingya have been without the attention of the world even until 2012 2015 70 the Rohingya bulk of the Rohingya have been expelled
နောက်ပိုင်းမှာရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေတပ်ဖြတ်ခံခဲ့ရတာကိုလူတော်တော်များများကတော့သိလာကြပြီပေါ့အဲ့ဒီမတိုင်ခင်တော့အတက်မှုကိုလည်းဒီကြားထဲမှာပို့ပြီးသိမှပြုလာအောင်လုပ်ပေးတယ်လို့
I do think that Britain owes something to the Rohingya, particularly since it was historically responsible for the situation. This is partly a result of colonial rule, not entirely. I mean, the Burmans are responsible as well. But under the British, they empowered this particular type of the more exclusionist kind of Burmese and Rakhine Buddhist identity. I think it would be great if Britain took up more of leadership in terms of helping the Rohingya out, and even doing things such as funding, setting up Rohingya studies programs in UK universities, and setting up scholarships to train a generation of Rohingya scholars who can help recapture their own history. I think that kind of groundwork could be done, and not just for the Rohingya. I think this should be done for some of the other ethnic minorities who have been obliterated and suppressed by the Burma majority and the Burmese state in the last 60, 70 years, the Kachin, the Karen, and so on.
Exactly. I mean, as I see it, the whole experimentation with colonization has been wrong. Not only just in South Asia, Southeast Asia, but across the world. Whether it is in Africa, Latin America, you name it. It has not done justice to the very people that were colonized. Today's wars and the sufferings owe it big time to what the colonists have done, whether here in America or in any part of the world. The sad part, as you have heard, the Rohingyas were used by the British to stop the Japanese fascist forces to march into what was the greater part of India, starting from Bengal to all the way to today's Pakistan. If the Japanese could not be stopped in Arakan and Burma, they would have taken over the entire India. And who comes to their support? The Rohingya people. They were used and and the Rohingya thought that yes, there will be some remuneration at the end. Probably they were given misinformation or being used or whatever, and this is part of again some kind of controversy. Rohingyas claim yes, that British promised and then they didn't fulfill, while probably at the higher echelon of British power, probably this was not even probably discussed. They wanted to utilize, whatever suited. And that's the end of the story. Look at Bangladesh today or Pakistan. When Jinnah got Pakistan, he said it's a moth-eaten Pakistan, at the mercy of Howe, Redcliffe, and that carved out the territory. This is a sad commentary. A lot of things, that you see today, people facing trouble and killing each other, or all those stuff. They were planted either in a sinister way or whatever. I don't know. There are others that can comment on, but surely they owe big time to the colonial experience.
There's a technical question on here, and I don't know who wants to answer it, so I'll just leave it for the three of you to decide. But the question is, can someone please elaborate on how Muslim and Buddhist populations of the Arakan were recorded in the colonial census? Was it according to the mother tongue, or was it according to the religion?
In the colonial census, they applied to they have different categories at different times, but generally they applied to people identified as Indian. They applied at the Indian register, but for groups that were identified as Burmese, as being native to Burma, they use ethnicity and language. So you would have people in Rakhine in Burma who were of Indian, perceived Indian origin. They'd be divided into their Hindu or Muslim, and then they would also be divided into, if I remember correctly, 8 major Indian language groups. Whereas for the groups that were identified as Burmese, they were broken into ethnicity, and ethnicity defined around the language that they used. That's my recollection.
Okay. There's a follow-up question here for you, Dr. Charney, that I do want to get to, and then I want to switch to our last topic before we end, which is your analogy of white privilege in the United States vis-a-vis Burma. The question is, do you think that there's any public willingness on the part of in Burma to reflect on the injustice of their attitude of superiority towards other ethnic groups?
I think there's, right now, I think that what has really come out in the protests that we saw and a lot of the discourse, not with the older generation, but with the so-called Generation Z and the millennials and everything, this generation is a lot more I guess it happens, doesn't it? So this generation is much more cosmopolitan, much more informed, much more open to a multicultural Burma, and that really bodes well for the future once they get the military aside. I think that there will be space to open up ways to reconcile, and I think this is hugely important, reconcile the Buddhist and Muslim, the Rohingya and Rakhine Buddhists in Rakhine, because I think that, like Niroma mentioned earlier, they've been divided instrumentally by the Burmese government, by the military, and I think that there has to be some kind of reconciliation, and I think that the younger generations will be open to that. It's going to be a lot harder with the older generations because their ways seem to be set, and they went through decades and decades of education and propaganda under the military government. I'm sorry, I've gone on, so I've forgotten your original question. That's the point I wanted to make.
So for the last question I have for the three of you are comments that came in, but I'm going to tie it in together into just one big question, and then we can end our program. And just so everybody knows, if you want to find this recorded webinar, you can find it on rohingya.org, and it'll take you to the YouTube channel where the program is recorded. And our next month in July, we will be having a program on human trafficking in Burma. And the date will be announced very shortly. So to the three of you, the question I have is this. Given everything that you know about the history of the Arakan, Burma in general, what advice would you give to the National Unity Government that is trying to make strides now to unify Burma and to move the country forward? And what can they do for the Rohingya?
I can throw in two things real quick. First of all, they did a really good thing actually creating a liaison with the Rohingya people, I think it was today or yesterday, and actually using the word Rohingya. which Aung San Suu Kyi and the older echelons leadership didn't do. The most important thing I think they can do is adopt an approach towards a more federal Burma, a federal constitution with true inclusion and equality for all the ethnic minorities, ethnic races in Myanmar, including the Rohingya. I think the Rohingya solution is also the Burma solution for all the ethnicities.
I should second Professor Charney's observation. In my opinion, the Burmese or Myanmarese experiment today can be summed up as being feudal. It is several hundred years old, and that is not how things ought to be or should be in the 21st century. They have to come out of their feudal mindset and embrace plurality, diversity. Otherwise, a country which is glued up on the way it is, with all the various races, ethnic groups fighting against the central government to be separate. You cannot just do that for too long. It's a self-defeating kind of proposal there. If they want to really have a unified Burma, they have to wake up and do things that are meaningful by embracing diversity, by recognizing that there are people that might look different, that might do things different, but they are the sons of the soil of our country. They need not prove themselves that, look, they have to come 200 years ago to be a bona fide citizen of Burma. While you allow people like Aimong, who was born in Bangladesh, to be MP in Arakan because he's a Rakhine Buddhist. This is double standard, right?
ဒီလူကဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဖြစ်သွားတာနဲ့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာတော့မမွေးဘဲနဲ့ဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာမွေးခဲ့တဲ့သူကရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်မှာလွတ်တော်အမှတ်လာလုပ်နေတယ်ဗျာဒါကမတရားဘူးဗျအဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့က
illegal immigration. In fact, this is an intolerance.
ဒီမှာပြောနေတဲ့ပေါ့လေ
based on
တရားခိုးဝင်လာတယ်ဆိုတဲ့စကားလုံးကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ဘလို့မှလက်ခံပေးလို့မရဘူး
the policy has what is going on
ဘာကြောင့်လဲဆိုရင်ဒီလူတွေကခိုးဝင်ပြီးတော့လာတဲ့သူတွေမဟုတ်ဘူးဒါကသူတို့ရဲ့ပင်ရင်ဒါလင်းဖြစ်တယ်ဒီလိုမဟုတ်ဘူးဆိုရင်တော့
with responsible the government
ဒီပြဿနာကဘယ်တော့မှပြီးမှာမဟုတ်ဘူး
the government what I mean the government not only the military
အဲ့တော့
those who are in power
အစိုးရကတာဝန်ယူမှာလားဒီလူတွေရဲ့ဘဝကိုအစိုးရဆိုတာကစစ်တပ်ကိုပဲကျွန်တော်ပြောချင်တာမဟုတ်ဘူးအားလုံးကိုကျွန်တော်ဆိုလိုချင်တယ်ဘယ်သူကရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့တာဝန်ယူမှာလဲကျူးလွန်ခဲ့တဲ့ဥစ္စာတွေကိုလည်း
and that never allow
တိုင်းကတာဝန်ခံဖို့လေလိုအပ်တယ်ဗျ
always put them at
ရေးရင်ကြီးတာဝန်ခံဖို့လေလိုအပ်ပါ
so
တယ်
that they are not united and the
အဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်အားလုံးကစီးလုံးကြပါလို့ပဲကျွန်တော်တိုက်တွန်းချင်တယ်ဒီသူပဲအစိုးရတက်တက်ပေါ့နော်အကုန်လုံးစီးလုံးကြပါအာရကန်ဒေသမှာရှိတဲ့နိုင်ငံရေးသမားတွေလည်းစီးလုံးကြပါအုပ်ချုပ်သူလူတန်းစားတွေလည်းစီးလုံးကြပြီးတော့ဒီမှာ
the Rakhine is self-feeling
စီးလုံးမှုကိုယူပြီးတော့လုပ်ကြပါ
even Rakhine academics are also responsible for that
ရခိုင်ပညာရှင်တွေကလည်းဒီလူမျိုးတုံးတက်ဖြတ်မှုကိုကျူးလွန်တဲ့နေရာမှာအားပေးအားမြောက်လုပ်ခဲ့တယ်အများကြီးရှိတယ်ဗျ
the whole country people become misunderstood
the misunderstanding ဒီတိုင်းပြည်တော်မှာရှိတဲ့လူတွေအကုန်လုံးကအထင်ကြီးလဲသွားတယ်ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေအပေါ်မှာ
they adopted the legitimization process in Burma
သူတို့တွေကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာ
from 1962
ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေကိုမရှိဘူးလို့လုပ်လိုက်တဲ့အဆင့်ထိတောင်ရောက်သွားတယ်ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်ရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေဘဝကအင်မတန်မှကို
this is what called
အန်ဒီယေရှိသွားပါတယ်ဒီအရာတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကပြုပြင်ပြောင်းလဲဖို့တကယ်ပဲလိုအပ်ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်
responsibility at the government and authorities to reconcile
အစိုးရကတာဝန်ယူပြီးတော့ကွဲပြဲသွားတဲ့အကွဲပြဲတွေကိုရင်ကြားစေးဖို့လိုအပ်ပါတယ် NUG ပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ဦးဆောင်ပြီးတော့အားလုံးကို
မျှမျှတတဆက်ဆံပြီးတော့အနာခံရတဲ့သူတွေဘက်ကနေပြီးတော့လည်းရပ်တည်ပေးဖို့လိုအပ်ပါတယ်အစိုးရဆိုတာမိဘနဲ့တူပါတယ်ကိုယ့်ရဲ့သားသမီးတွေကိုကြောသားရင်သားဖိတ်ကြားလို့မရပါဘူးဒီသားတွေအကုန်လုံးကသူ့ရဲ့သားသမီးတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီသားသမီးတွေအားလုံးကိုတာတူညီမျှစွာ
The question of whether or not they are indigenous, they are not a citizen, this question issues have come.
နောက်တစ်ခုကနိုင်ငံသားဖြစ်ရဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေကနိုင်ငံသားလားနိုင်ငံသားမဟုတ်ဘူးဒါကပြောစရာကိုမလိုတာဗျဒီအာရကန်ဒေတာရဲ့ပြည်ဌာနေဓမ္မမူလပိုင်ရှင်ဓမ္မတွေကရိုဟင်ဂျာတွေဗျဒီတို့ကြောင့်ရိုဟင်ဂျာလို့ပြောလိုက်တာနဲ့ automatic ဒီလူတွေကအာရကန်ဒေတာကလို့လူတိုင်းကတဘာကသိကြပါတယ်ဒါအပြင်ဒီမြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာလည်းဒီလူတွေကနိုင်ငံသားရကိုရရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
and all their rights and freedom should be ensured
အဲ့ဒီတော့တို့တွေရဲ့လွတ်လပ်စွာတွာလာခွင့်တွေကိုလည်းပြုလုပ်ပေးဖို့လိုအပ်ပါတယ်ကန့်သတ်ထားလို့မရပါဘူး
Thank you
ဒါလေးတွေကိုလုပ်ပေးပါလို့ကျွန်တော်ပြောချင်တယ်အဲ့ဒီတော့ရိုဟင်ဂျာဖြစ်ပြီဆိုတာနဲ့ဒီလူတွေကတိုင်းပြည်ကသူတွေပဲဖြစ်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံကသူတွေပဲဖြစ်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံကိုပဲပြန်ရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံသားလည်းသူတို့ရဲ့ဒေသဖြစ်ပါတယ်
and the international
စစ်မြစ်ချက်မြုပ်ဒေသကမြန်မာပြည်ပဲဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကိုပဲပြန်ရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီတော့ကြောင့်ဒီလူတွေရဲ့အရေးကိစ္စကို
Thank you, Mr. Islam. I think those points are well taken, and thank you, Professor Charney. Thank you, Dr. Siddiqui. This has been a really wonderful start to the Arno series. Thank you to everyone who's participated, and we look forward to seeing you in July for our Human Trafficking Program. Thank you.